Hello, welcome to Criminological Theory. One of the things we're going to be doing throughout this semester is we're going to be exploring a lot of different topics that really explain what criminology is, what are the theories that really underlie criminological thought, and on top of that, how this can best explain some of the issues such as, why do people commit crimes? So one of the things you're going to see is we're going to follow sequencing of the textbook that's been provided. And while we follow that sequencing, I'm also going to obviously lecture on specific topics outside the materials. One of the things you're going to notice is that I am normally not going to read off of these slides. So you're going to want to follow along with them as we go along and take your own notes. And the reason why I don't read off of them is because obviously, unless there's something exceptionally important, they're really here to help kind of guide where the thought pattern is going to go and help you structure with your different notes. So you can see here the first chapter we're going to look at is looking at an overview of issues in criminological theory. And a lot of this is going to be, just underlining what theory is, how we look at the science, some issues around things like deviance, what is considered crime, and then also the UCR, the NCVS, and a couple other data sources that we use. So let's get started. The first slide you'll see is titled, What is Criminology? And within this slide, what you're going to find is not just the fact that we use science in criminology, and we really do, we've continued to use science, but what we're trying to answer at the end of the day is that question you see there, why do people commit crime? Whether you believe it is due to biological reasons, to sociological reasons, to even psychiatric reasons, or some mixture of all of those. Human behavior has always been something we can understand both morally, ethically, legally, religiously, and as well, even theoretically, through this idea of we live in a society that is structured by laws and by order and by morals and values. And some people will obviously violate those morals and values. So, why do they do that? When we see the question that we ask specifically in criminology that gets to the science aspect, which is why is it different from philosophical legal reasoning, what we really see is, in essence, at the end of the day, the law is supposed to be the law. The way it is written by politicians and passed as legislation, so codified as law, and you'll hear me use the word codified as law often, say that a piece of legislation was passed, is that whatever the statute states is in essence what is supposed to be enforced. So when a crime occurs and it meets a statutory definition, you're supposed to, obviously, if there's a punishment attached, punish the person. If there's not a punishment attached, why is that? Like, why is there not a punishment attached? When we talk about philosophical reasoning, humanity has always tried to understand the behavior of human beings, whether it's through religious reasons, moral reasons, even ethical reasons around this philosophy of, but why? There's a big question of, but why? You see, even in crime, we say, why do people commit crime? Philosophy is often joked about as the theories, not just, I shouldn't really say theories, but basically this understanding of why. It's not that far off from the truth. What we try to do in criminology is apply science. We try to test things scientifically. We come up with ideas, hypotheses, and that really builds into theory. Now, if you've never ever looked at theory in terms of its definition, there's one for you. And what it really shows us is not necessarily often a concrete reasoning as to why something occurs, but a possible reason why something occurs. In criminology, we don't like to use our theories as concrete definitions or reasoning as to why something occurs because of the past. You'll see that when we get into some of the schools that look at biological theories of crime, there was unfortunately things like eugenics that occurred. Politicians took our ideas and kind of ran radical with them and produced ideas that obviously were, in some measure, not good. They were deliberately harmful to individuals. So we do, on some measure, have this problem here of what we want. And in criminology, good theory is basically a possible explanation. It doesn't cover everything, and it's not concretely defined, but it covers enough that it gives us a possible reason why. So that's why I say we start off with the question of what is crime? Now, definitional wise, you're going to see two key definitions for us on this slide: mala in se and mala prohibita. Each of these can be understood by what the crimes are that occur underneath them. Mala in se would be best understood by things like murder. We pretty much uniformly agree that killing a human being, even when we give exemptions for self-defense and defense of others, is wrong. There's a uniqueness, especially in areas like law enforcement, where in the defense of others or the defense of oneself, a police officer could, through the use of force, elect to use deadly force. So they are allowed to observe law breaking, observe the situation that's unfolding before them, and make a determination as to what is going on. The rest of us in society, we're highly encouraged, again, unless it's in defense of oneself or defense of others, not to kill. So when we look at evil in and of itself, it's pretty much stuff that most human beings would agree. And when we say most, it's close to 100%. Most human beings would agree this is evil, this is wrong. So it's murder, it's rape, it's forms of aggravated assault, where you're deliberately harming or maiming a person, even permanently disfiguring them. It's really severe crimes. Mala prohibita is different. It's because at some point in society, politicians and even the people who elect those politicians have said this needs to be an outlawed act. So you see here the picture that's on the slide, and that picture is actually pulled from the textbook. This is a picture showing a person paying for a prostitute. Prostitution is one of those mala-prohibited crimes where it might be legal in some places, but it's most definitely not legal here in the United States. Although there has been some legitimate questions as to, do we consider some forms of what is not normally considered prostitution, but is borderline close? Prostitutive acts is, I guess, is the phrase you could use, to be legalized. And we see this now, obviously, in the internet age, with the ability for you to pay for sexual images and videos and even some sexual services. It is a tricky crime in terms of, the question that is asked is, as long as the person's not being trafficked and the person is not underage, who is the victim? And that's one of the issues with mala prohibita crime, is that some of them might be considered what we call victimless crimes. You'll see I'll use air quotes a lot. That doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily a victim. It could be actually the person who engages in the act themselves. They are victimized by it. But it's one of those tricky things where it's only illegal because people have said it's illegal. Okay? So we're kind of answering some of these questions of where we're going in criminology in terms of how I look at criminological theory. We're starting off with, what is crime? Another aspect of it is deviance. You see here the definition. And when we talk about deviance, the tricky thing that people mistake is, well, is it necessarily against the law? Often no. And what we really mean here is, it's something that most people don't want to encourage the behavior act of because they consider it immoral. I used to joke to students all the time when I would teach this in juvenile delinquency about deviance, that when I was in middle school, this was coming into and out of the Columbine years. So when Columbine happened in 1999, that kids were considered deviant if they did things like wear a trench coat, or if they dressed in all black, or even if they, well, you don't see it a lot in middle school, fortunately, but in high school, if they went out for a smoke break. Obviously, underage, you're not supposed to have possession of a cigarette, but unless we can prove that you directly bought a cigarette illegally, it's not technically a criminal act. It could be considered deviant. Another thing that students get wrong is they automatically assume things like speeding is an act of deviance. Well, no, speeding is still codified under the law. That's why you have signs around. So you still can't speed. So it's still against the law, so it's not deviant. So it's this mixture of, there might not be a law against it, but we really don't encourage it. Or, for example, for juveniles, it's only a crime because you're committing it because you're under the age of 18. Right? So those are some of the differences. We're going to look at 4 specific paradigms throughout this course. We're going to look at each of these different paradigms, breaking them down by, in essence, what we consider the schools of thought. And each of them are going to be explored more in depth, but each of them have some interplay with either rational choice, free will, biological theories of criminality, what we call proto-biological theories of criminality, or in essence, the early days of how we tried to understand, does the body have, or even genes have an impact on crime? Are there aspects of society where people are in conflict, right? This could be on the basis of race, gender, ethnicity, or even monetary status. And then how we've tried to integrate these all together. And so that's where we're eventually going to get to. We are also going to look at some other measures of how we study these theories with this classification, how we do this analysis. You see here, whether it's on the micro or the macro level, we're going to study how individuals are specifically understanding and analyzing why crime is occurring and what are the factors that are leading to criminality, for example. And then we are going to talk a lot about human nature and even how these laws and ideas are written, including, as you can see there, consensual perspectives and conflict perspectives. We're going to see there's going to be, throughout each of these different schools, some interplay, especially with consensus and conflict, right? This idea of, do most people agree as to what the law should be, or is there some type of different groups disagreeing and they're enforcing their will upon the others? As we build out into the theories, we are going to talk about what good theories are, right? One of the biggest things is there are different ways that you can make a good theory. A lot of crim theory tries to be pretty wide in scope, which means that we're going to try and cover a lot of bases in terms of trying to understand the complexity of an issue, right? So if we can look at it both a sociological and a biological, for example, or sociological and psychological, or criminal versus biological, we're going to try and look at a lot of different scopes. But one of the biggest things we really get into is causality. Can we prove in some measure, and you see here with the variable explanations, whatever we're predicting is explained by something else? There's a line in science that basically says that correlation doesn't equal causation. And that can be true. But what we're often trying to find is there something that possibly could be an explanation, maybe not directly as the cause, but might have some relevancy as to why things occur. To the point that, as you see with the image that's also provided here and is pulled out of the textbook as well, there actually used to be a theory of criminality that looked at what was considered a deviant behavior, which was being tattooed, as being one in which an individual would be involved in criminality. And oftentimes it was because the people who were getting arrested just happen to have tattoos, or once they were behind a correctional environment, they tattooed themselves. So the question is, it's almost like the chicken and an egg question. We're talking about causality. Was it the tattoos that led to the crime, or was it they committed crimes and they just happen to have tattoos? Those are some of the tricky nature. If we go even further, we're gonna look at some of these things in more in depth. As I said, we also look at how we measure crime as criminologists. This is very important. As a criminologist, I like stats. I like looking at information. Some of you probably have involvement or have seen things like the UCR. We're also going to talk about the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, and we're also going to talk about self-report data. The UCR is our oldest resource for measuring crime. The FBI produces it. All law enforcement agencies are, on a voluntary basis, are supposed to give their information of the data to the FBI, and it's mostly reported on things that were reported to them and then what led to an arrest. So oftentimes you might see they don't report convictions. There'll be an encouragement of convictions, might not always be reported, but it can be available in that information. But we're trying on some measure to see, okay, what specifically is being given to the FBI from these local law enforcement. And as it mentions here on the slide, it's broken out into two different categories. One is the index offenses. Now, the index offenses are the ones that are listed here. And it makes sense that these are the index offenses in a measure, or some people have heard them referred to as type 1 versus type 2 offenses. These are the crimes that are the most serious. So, of course, we're going to want to be tracking these rates. And we want to be able to report to the rest of society not only what these rates are, but on top of that, are we doing anything about them? Like, are we arresting people? Who's getting arrested? Who are the victims? How are they being victimized? That's been added recently to the UCR, or even another system reporting, which is the NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, we are able to track this information. So you see it's broken down by violent crimes and also property offenses. The UCR has some strengths and weaknesses as shown here. Again, we have a lot of good information. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show it to you. That's what the link is on the slide to the UCR Crime Data Explorer. Right now, the UCR Crime Data Explorer, if you use it, the publicly available one, you can only really get access to the information from 1985 to about 2022. But we do actually have a ton of information to tell us what the crime rate is. And we actually can look at the crime rate through a large historical trend, which we'll see as we get towards the end of this chapter. But also, too, we often see that there's some weaknesses, specifically outside of the two major offenses that are almost always reported, which you see the ones listed there on the slide. The counting is not always sufficiently done. In 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, some law enforcement agencies did not report the information, and the estimate was close to 60%. So that means we have a gap, in essence, of our knowledge of what was the true crime rate in the United States. Was it really trending downwards as it appears, or is it something where we can't give it an accurate picture because we just don't have the information? Another problem, too, is how we count the crime. We change definitions of crimes all the time. As a matter of fact, on the UCR, the definition of rape was changed in 2013 to not only expand how a person could unfortunately be victimized by rape, but who can be victimized by rape. So we don't often have a concrete codification of what this is supposed to look like, which can harm our analysis of statistics. Let's take a look at this crime data. So I'm going to show it to you. And I apologize, it's not cooperating right away in terms of what I want to show for the UCR. Okay, there it is. So what you should be seeing here is the Crime Data Explorer, again compiled by the FBI. And there's a lot of different data sets as you see. There's all data collections that are available and how many agencies out of the over 18,000 agencies actually reported this information. They also have on crime itself, hate crime, expanded homicide data, property, arrest, the quarterly uniform crime report, and then information about law enforcement employees, including use of force data and officers who have been killed and assaulted or even unfortunately killed themselves on the job. You can also break it down by state. And obviously here I am in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So if I wanted to look at Pennsylvania specific, I could go there. When you go into the Crime Data Explorer, one of the things you're going to see is, again, whether you keep it on the national level, you're going to see a year selection. You could do it by state, and even the benefits you have with state, and you'll see that here, is that when you do, for example, if I go into Pennsylvania, I can actually put specific agencies. So if I wanted to do Philadelphia, for example, and you see when you click on it, it shows as starting by county. So it starts with Adams County. This information is available here. Let's go back to the national level. The UCR allows us to get a trend in crime presented. We like to look at the data often in terms of a 5, 10, or 20-year presentation, right? A really good presentation is normally by 10 years because it gives us a pretty accurate flow of where's the rate of violent crime. And you can see in 2012, there was a large amount, then it started to dip, then we went back up, then it started to dip slightly, and then we went back up. And this is a rate per 100,000 people per year. So the numbers you're seeing here is 387 offenses per 100,000 people per year, per 100,000 people per year. So it gives us some ability to kind of standardize the data by doing it per 100,000 people. They even tell you how the numbers are calculated, right? They mention that they don't have sufficient data to estimate for arson. They tell you what the violent crimes are. They tell you their methodology. They even say here, data released from 1960 through 2020. They're going to have all the data files available there. They mention the change in rape the definition, as I mentioned before, and also some of the issues with arson. If you wanted to pull out the full picture, as I said before, it only goes right now on the publicly available from 1985 to 2022. You see here, our violent crime rate was dramatically high in the 80s and the 90s. We'll come back to this at some point in a future lecture because this is going to lead into a couple areas where how theory was applied to different issues. And also, if you don't want to do lines, you can do it by bar. Nice, switching up the change. You can download this information. You can also, when you include previous years, you include past 10 years, you can do the NIBRS data, which now shows us our crime offender versus victim demographics. You can do it by numbers or even percentages. A lot of people like percentages because it shows them a more accurate picture of where our offender age and victim age is. We see here, it's a pretty young offense rate in terms of 10 to 19. It's disturbing that it's at 16%, but 20 to 29 tends to be uniform. We see here that nationally, it is a male-dominated area of problem, and it's pretty much 50-50 when it comes to male versus female. This is for violent crime. For race, we're seeing here across the United States, for offender, it's 45%. For blacks, it's 44%. So pretty much an even mixture here. But there's still more white people who are being victimized. And then, of course, they do ethnicity by whether you're Hispanic or not Hispanic. And we see here offender, not Hispanic leads the way, and victim, not Hispanic. So this is all violent crime. You say to me, Dr. S, maybe I want to take a look at not just the victim demographics and the offense characteristics, but now I want to take a look at something else other than violent crime. I want to go to homicide, something that really catches the national attention. Now we see here, ethnicity still remains the same, but now race is changing in terms of offender versus victim. Sex is also changing in terms of victim. Male is increasing, but offender it's staying the same as male. Age is also relatively the same. We can do the same things with property crimes. We can look at all property crimes to see the trends, both in amount, which you see here again. Not surprised that our violent crimes are high in the 80s and the 90s. They were high for property crimes as well. They're starting to come back up. Unfortunately, we are seeing that trend. But also, too, with the same offender demographics in terms of age, sex, race, and ethnicity. It really allows us to get a pretty accurate picture of what the crime rate is, and then on top of that, what has been reported. And we see here the NIBRS is a little bit different than the UCR, where they mention up here the UCR had about 15,726 agencies reporting. The NIBRS is a little bit different because only about 6,000 law enforcement agencies reported. This is an important thing to know, obviously, because when you're presenting this information as an individual, for example, who is a criminologist, you want to make certain you're telling people we have a pretty accurate picture, but we don't have the complete picture. And that's one of the problems with the UCR and then the NIBRS that's also included together. So let's go back to the lecture. Where we were. Oops. Let me switch the view here. So we were on the UCR. Now let's look at the National Crime Victimization Survey. I did not provide a link for that one, but it's something you can look up, mostly because some of the data is not presented as well as the Crime Data Explorer for the UCR. But this now gives us an accurate picture of what we call the dark figure of crime. We do believe, unfortunately, that there is a hidden crime rate in the United States because some people, for whatever reason, will not report being a victim of crime. It could be embarrassment. It could be fear of retaliation and retribution. There's a large number of measures as why the people don't report crime. So it allows us to show, as we see here on the slide, that our estimates might be off. And we are seeing that uniformly every year that we've done the UCR. We do it on about a 3-year time period, but each and every single time period that we've done it, we have found that our crime rate is much higher than what's reported to the UCR. It does have the weaknesses in the fact that it doesn't account completely for children, for example. We still haven't really done a great job in accounting for children in a lot of our data reporting in criminology. And it also doesn't account for the homeless. How are you able to get access to give them a survey? Also, what you can see here too is we actually asked the victims. So, for example, for homicide, you can still ask the surviving family members, but you can't ask a deceased victim, obviously, about what happened and how they were victimized. So that is a concern. But the real benefit is it has a 90% completion rate, as you saw on a previous slide. So it actually might be a little bit more uniform in giving us a fuller picture of what crime is in the United States. Self-report studies also allow us to kind of bridge this gap as well. It's to ask people, not only were you victimized, but have you ever offended yourself? A lot of people, when they know they're giving an anonymous survey, they'll report that they've been involved in offending, and that will allow us to kind of get a little bit more of an accurate picture of things that we don't know, those gaps in our surveillance, basically. But much like some of the other weaknesses with some of the other surveys, it's not systemic, right? We don't have enough people doing it, so we can't use that as the yearly estimate, right? So we're gonna. I really encourage you to take a look at a lot of these data sources, and specifically on your own, go and Google the NCV. There is data provided through the Bureau of Justice Statistics to really just kind of look a little bit further into, well, what is the accurate picture of what crime is specifically through the NCVS? Because it is a rather interesting part of criminology. You got to get used to knowing data. For the crime rate since the 1900s, and I'll show you again another page, which looks at the crime wave, crime wave. We kind of know where it was, including one of our highest rates of crime other than the 80s and the 90s was during Prohibition. And one of the biggest issues, obviously, with that was violent crime occurred because people were organized crime was coming about around this illegal distribution and distillation of alcohol. So the 1900s had some issues with crime related around immigration. That was that mass influx in the late 1800s, early 1900s of both Irish and Italian immigrants, for example. We did have issues with crime going up, but the early 1900s weren't as bad as when we went into the Prohibition era. Now, of all things, crime dropped World War II, mostly because men went to war. So when the men were overseas fighting, we didn't have a huge problem with crime. It kind of leveled out post-World War II. The 60s saw an uptick around certain crimes due to the civil rights movement and the so-called colloquially termed hippie movement. But it kind of leveled out until, again, the 80s and the 90s, which produced a new era. We actually now are considered despite with an uptick, are considered to be in one of the more peaceful time periods in the United States when it comes to the crime rate, because it is nowhere close to the 80s and 90s time period, and we hope we never get there again. So as I said before, let me show you what it looks like on this picture of the history of it, just to give you a little bit more information. So we're going to go back to this Crime Data Explorer, but now we're going to look at an article from Medium. The reason why I presented this article to you is because this person actually put together pretty good research looking at first the crime wave from the 1980s, and this is what we were talking about. The rate of homicides per offense per population was dramatically high. We see this uptick here in 2020 during the pandemic and leading into 2021. We have started, the picture isn't fully formed here, we've started to level out a little bit. We're coming back down. But the intentional homicide rate, we can see this ebb and flow. And look at this time period. Early 1900s, we start to see an uptick around immigration. It starts to come up. Great Depression. Boom, we're coming into this time period, into the Great Depression, and then World War II. We see this drop. Little escalation when our men came home. Then we see it go down. And then we start in the 70s, coming back up to dramatically high in the 80s and the 90s. And then back down. We try to look at these crime waves as first a picture of homicide, but also two, what were our big crime waves? The 20s there was some issues there, but the 60s through the 90s was considered the other crime period, right? And then this article goes in a little bit more to look at, was it the economy? Was it access to firearms? Was it homicides by per weapon and even gun ownership, and homicide by age and by gender? Issues with gun control, murder rates in a specific area, or does it have a connection to the death penalty or even abortion and crime? But really what I wanted to show you guys, and this is included in the slide, you can look at it a little bit more, really what the crime rate, what this issue is. So the mid-ladies to late 1990s, we really say crack cocaine drove the increase in crime waves. You see crack indices by race showed it was dramatically impacting different groups. And then also, too, the baby boom, we have more people. So when we have more people, one of the things that we see is that they were likely going to be the individuals who are getting involved in the crimes, because obviously, there's just more people in the population, and our birth rate has continued to trend down. And it also, there's a reduced lethality, believe it or not, even with greater access to weapons. And then mass incarceration. We just started locking a lot of people up. So when we started to lock a lot of people up, also in two, what happened was we started to look for more crimes. So that also impacts the crime wave. Just want to kind of give you some how we look at this data as criminologists. All right, so let's go back to our lecture. Specifically go to distribution and continue on. We do know there are also regional differences. For example, down south, what we have seen is that there is actually issues with gun homicides in certain parts of the South. In the North, we have a greater issue in the major cities with things like gun homicides, but we mostly have it around like increased property offenses. The same in some of like the Northeast. And then on the West Coast, we have more of these quality of life and order offenses, including things related around drugs. And then obviously in some major cities, we have it with a very high homicide rate. Hotspots is a terminology we use a lot in criminology, which basically discusses that there are certain areas where crime just stays up and remains up for whatever reason. Right now in the city of Philadelphia, despite the fact that homicides have started to trend downward, thankfully, last year, we know that gun violence has become a huge issue. So Philadelphia, Chicago, and a couple other major cities are major hotspots for gun violence and gun homicides. There are other areas where there are hotspots for certain property crimes. Believe it or not, there was a lot of suburban areas that are seeing a large influx of catalytic converter thefts in the past 2 years than you saw in some of the major cities. So we do use that terminology in criminology. We also look at things like the time of day. As a matter of fact, when we're talking about time of day, let alone time of year, we're entering into a time period when this lecture was being recorded where we're entering into spring. So as the temperature starts to turn to be a little bit more warm and nicer, we expect the crime rate to go up. As a matter of fact, we know a pretty good sweet spot for crime is anywhere between average temperatures of like 65 to about 75 degrees. Because people are obviously going to be able to go out and travel. They spend more time outside. It's more comfortable. And then the time periods, when we're talking about time of the year, May through early September, because some schools go back later in September. When kids are out of school, crime's going to go up. The same thing with age. We know that there's a heavy level of involvement in crime starting around the ages of puberty, and then a desistance, a stopping, once you get into 18 to early 20s. We're going to discuss later on in other chapters why we have a gender ratio problem, more men involved in crimes, and then what we do with social controls. And finally, we will talk about race and ethnicity throughout a lot of these chapters. For this one, we just kind of touch on, unfortunately, the most victimized individuals in the United States are Native Americans or indigenous people, whichever terminology you prefer. But if you compare the rates compared to the population, African American people are suffering a higher murder rate of victimization than any other group. And it really does appear that a lot of our homicides, especially in major areas around the United States, are an intra-racial crime, not an interracial. It is still either black on black, Hispanic on Hispanic, Asian on Asian, or white on white. So we'll see that as we explore more in depth. But the first chapter is kind of laying out theory, a broad overview, and then we're going to start getting into stuff in more detail. So I hope that this was helpful for you.